Good afternoon, good evening to people joining us near and far. This is the 10th edition of USISPF Indo-Pacific Security Dialogues. It's a little earlier than what we had planned. Normally we do this monthly, but given the current state of the world, we thought we had to get an expert panel together. These, of course, are a monthly panel discussion with experts featuring think tankers, journalists, academics, former government officials, now wearing a private sector hat to discuss all things Indo-Pacific. Of course, the caveat here is in our previous episode, we ventured a little beyond the traditional Indo-Pacific because of the state of the world we're in. We're right now talking about the shifting sands of the Middle East that have been stirred by the escalating conflict, realigning regional powers, and mounting fears over the security of maritime routes, energy markets, global trade flows, and human mobility. For this discussion, we'll expand the lens further, examining this unfolding crisis in Iran and the broader West Asian theater and how it's shaping up geopolitical calculations for Indo-Pacific markets. We already know about the disruption in energy security, straining supply chains, maritime, aviation, and just the intensifying technological and diplomatic competition. But to unpack all this and more, I have with me a stellar panel, people who first time to this show, but don't need too much of introduction otherwise to people in DC and the policy world. Dr. Dinsha Mistree, Research Fellow at Hoover Institute in Stanford University, and Mohammed Soliman, Senior Fellow, Middle East Institute, and Director, Middle East and North Africa and McLarty Associates. And that's not all. We will be joined a little later by Isaac Stonefish, founder and CEO of Strategic Risk. So I'm Akshok Girtadas, and just some housekeeping rules here. These conversations are being recorded and live streamed, and will also be available on USISPF YouTube platform. So I'm going to start with a few questions, and please feel free to put your question in the chat box with your name and affiliation, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the very limited time frame we have here. Firstly, Dinsha and Mohammed, a very warm welcome to you. The state of the world is a little different today, but thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having us.
So, Dinsha, I want to start with you first before I get to Mohammed, right? Much has been waxed lyrical on India's strategic autonomy, this delicate balancing act across West Asian adversaries in Israel and Iran, and its most vital partner in the United States and other regional partners, particularly in the global south. We've sort of seen China speak about BRIC solidarity, this talk about global south cooperation. And of course, what's been in the limelight is India's energy security, the choke points in the Strait of Hormuz, maritime routes, and basically India's economic vulnerability right now, not just with the energy crisis, but with remittances, human mobility. So right now, it's a little sluggish in the immediate short run for the fourth largest economy.
Well, thank you for having me. I think it's actually a very, very interesting time right now for India for a number of reasons. Obviously, the short-term developments. I think the big question is how long India can stay non-aligned in this regard. Of course, Modi was in Israel right before the attack started. At the same time, India has long-standing deep relations to Iran, and various elements of the Indian government have tried to maintain strong relations, or at least friendly relations with both sides. As this crisis drags on, uh, obviously we all hope that it stops sooner than it probably will. But as this crisis drags on, how long can India really stay on the sidelines? When does it have to get off of the sidelines and actually do something? Or does it even have to do that at all? I think these are the big, big questions for India. I think there's also a deeper thing that's going on, and this is actually pretty, sort of the happy silver lining on a very dark cloud. Uh, India, for the most part, whenever I've talked to officials there, they've been really interested in when they think about energy, in thinking about affordability, in thinking about environment, green and pollution, of course. Energy security, by and large, during India's most prosperous days, these last 40 years, energy security has never really been a real issue for them. Nothing like what the US had to deal with in the 1970s or anything like that. Obviously, energy prices, oftentimes out of their control, global prices. India would take whatever they could get. But it wasn't like, for instance, you've never seen the Indian government do a national energy strategy or anything like that. One would expect that both with what we saw with India and Russia over the last 2 years, with the oil deals that were there, as well as now with this Middle East conflict, that India will probably think much more about diversifying its energy supply chains. We'll look at other countries and other partnerships. just to make sure that they're not so heavily reliant on the Middle East. And that actually opens up a number of really interesting and exciting possibilities.
There's a very interesting story. I was talking to someone in Washington who mentioned when India used to purchase Iranian oil, and someone asked them why. And so, a leading government official once said, well, the reason why the word bazaar is Persian. So it's a very interesting little anecdote there. And now coming to you, Mohammed. Again, first time to the show. At the outset, congratulations on your book, West Asia, a new grand strategy for the Middle East. I was there for one of your book talks at your home institute in the Middle East Institute last week. So highly recommend it for folks who want to understand the region a little more. I first interacted with you a few years ago when you wrote for MEI on a term that now many know, but many may still not, the Indo-Abrahamic Alliance. Very interesting term. It just stood out to me. And I want to quote from your article then, which describes how India, Israel, and the UAE are creating this new trans-regional order, right? And that's three out of the four I2 U2 nations right there. But interestingly, you go on to add that the Abrahamic Accords fructified this alliance, and you say, and I quote, along with Turkey's bid to return as a leader of a Muslim order and the growing distance between UAE and Pakistan, have created an unlikely and unprecedented Indo-Abrahamic trans-regional order. The emerging multilateral pact may fill the gap that the United States is leaving in the Middle East and has the potential to transform the region's geopolitics and geoeconomics. So, for folks who haven't come across this term, how do you notice this pattern building up, and why should we be paying more attention to it?
Wow, I like it's very interesting that you are quoting a piece I wrote 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I think so. So it's a very long time ago. I think I still stand by the underlying assumptions of this piece, and I think putting this to paper right after the Abraham Accords, I think it was intellectually ambitious. But I'm an engineer, I'm a structural realist, I believe in systems, and I think the conversions of interest between Delhi, Tel Aviv, and Abu Dhabi at that time it started to feel clearer to me. And then, of course, got codified with the I2U2 and then the India Middle East Europe corridor. And I believe that this is where we are right now. Moody's trip to Israel right before the Israeli-American attacks on Iran, the UE strong relations with India. You have seen this on the trade side, also on the political side, the close relationship between Modi and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. So I believe that the underlying assumptions around this Indo-Abrahamic configuration is still there. I think the only thing that's still not clear is how the region is reacting to this, A. B, what's the role of the United States, which is still the biggest security player? That's B. C, I mean, what does it mean for the geopolitical rise of Pakistan after last year's war? What does it mean for Turkey's role? Those are questions that I don't think that there's a clear answer to, because we are in the middle of that sort of transformation right now. And Iran war is one of those sort of force multiplier catalysts for existing trends. And I think it's going to have an impact on a lot of those assumptions and questions that we have.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those alliances are being tested right now, and we want to get a little more into it. But
Let me
Dinsha, while
say
we're
something
plugging
here.
books,
Let me say something here
yeah,
quickly.
please.
You use the word alliances, and I think the one thing maybe that I will take back, maybe I think maybe I was not clear about. I try to envision things as coalitions rather than
Mm,
alliances. You can have a lot of
mm,
overlap. I don't really believe that we're going to enter an era or in an era of 100% alliances. I don't believe
yeah.
so. But then you're going to have configurations around 80% alignment on certain issues, but you can have issue by issue, right? Because I think the
Mm.
word alliance, the way it's used in literature to describe something as closely tied as NATO or the transatlantic partnership alliance during the Cold War, I think it gives people an idea that there's 100% alignment on every aspect of the relationship. And I don't particularly that this is the right terminology to describe so many of those sort of alignments, partial alignments, or coalitions. At that time, I think when I used that term, it was maybe because of the lack of my own awareness of how this is going to go. But that's an anecdote here to the term that you used.
Yeah, in fact, it's very interesting because some in New Delhi may squirm at the word alliances given India's strategic autonomy and this firmly non-alignment policy. And given New Delhi has done a little more diplomacy through multilateral forum, these talking about the Quad and the I2U2. We'll get a little more into that. And,
Well,
Dinsha, while we're plugging books in, you have one coming up, and talks about the 1% of the 1% in the United States, the Indian American diaspora that's risen to the highest echelons from public service to private service. So can't wait to check that out. But while while we're examining the diaspora, the Middle East, of course, is home to several members of the diaspora, particularly the Malayali community from Kerala. And of course, we discussed this last time as well on our show. Like Kerala's economy at one point relied heavily on remittances coming from that. But the expat story writes itself, right? Multinationals with large established Dubai operations, hedge funds with DIFC addresses, family offices with golden visas, and children in elite Dubai schools. So the ramifications are just more than a conflict that may last a few weeks, to quote President Trump, or as he anticipates. And another credo that he's famous for is location, location, location. That's a key factor for businesses. Another credo that he's famous for. Has this shown that the economic miracles don't mitigate geopolitical hotbeds? Is this sort of an inflection point for the diaspora and this Dubai dream, or on the Gulf region at whole, or is it just too early to tell?
These are hard questions. Well, I'll tell you just personally, anecdotally, my cousin lives in Dubai. He occasionally remits money back to India. He hasn't been leaving. He says that he goes out and watches what his daughter calls the fireworks, and they feel very comfortable and safe in UAE. I don't know. I mean, I think that the reason people have come from India to the Middle East as opposed to other diaspora communities who've relocated to the Middle East, it's not for security, it's been for economic opportunity. And I suspect that once things get a little more calm, that Indians will continue to go. But who knows? People move for all kinds of reasons, largely aspirational, sometimes due to security concerns. And there's sometimes these overriding narratives that develop. So it's very hard to say whether communities like, as you mentioned, the Malayalis, Kerala getting 30% of its remittances largely from the Middle East, whether over time that connection will continue. I would expect it to, but people sometimes turn off of these kinds of things. I will say that the latent impact on India's economy that will come from any kind of recession or geoeconomic slowdown, India isn't that well integrated into the global economy. In certain areas, they are, but it's not like India is, the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. Where India is integrated into the global economy is in services, and particularly in remittances. And so when I'm thinking about what might happen to this huge, large economy, the areas where I expect the most downturn, obviously areas where there might be energy needs, right? So heavy manufacturing like steel, things like that, airplanes or airline industry, but also in geographic areas where you have large communities that are in the Middle East. Again, Kerala being a standout example of that. So if you're looking to see where the Indian economy will thrive and where it might lag a little bit more, especially as this conflict drags out, I think a lot of attention has been given to the energy demanding areas of the economy, but we also have to focus on just geographically wherever those diaspora communities are coming from too. Certainly going to be some kind of slowdown there.
Well, Dinsha, a hard question. That's why curveball says you're loaded up and you're going to hit it out of the park. That's an interesting point there about India's manufacturing, because there's a lot of incentive in New Delhi with Make in India and PLI schemes to kind of move from the services, from agrarian to services that India's economy transitioned to, skipping the manufacturing that kind of made China the behemoth of the world, which of course India is now trying to catch up to. And I'll get to that a little bit. But Mohammed, I want to take some part of the question to you, because you're the Middle East scholar, by day and night, and there's a lot of outlook on the role of Dubai right now, right? And it's a crown jewel of the GCC, a financial behemoth, this expat paradise. It's a data center destination and tourism central with all the sports and entertainment. Dubai has survived crisis before. We can talk about 2008 financial crisis, which of course most of the world suffered from, but it burst Dubai's real estate bubble, so important to it, and required an Abu Dhabi bailout. People forget Burj Dubai is the reason it's called Burj Khalifa, is for one of those reasons. Arab Spring sent tremors through every Gulf capital late 2, 3 years later. COVID, of course, shut the world down. There have been obituaries written on Dubai, and you know that better than anyone, But the consensus from Middle East scholars is even if Dubai survives this current conflict, the war has sort of retired the myth that this is a sophisticated enough platform that can insulate itself from its own neighborhood. I mean, and also, what's the future for places like Doha and Abu Dhabi that, play second fiddle to Dubai, but they're trying to catch up because aviation industry like airlines like Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar are the envy of the world, not just for their service, but because of their geostrategic location that, enhances their offerings more than other airlines. So I'm just curious right now, has the sheen on Dubai gone, or is just wait and watch?
I highly recommend the book for you, just talking about the role of the Gulf and the rise of the what you call the Dubai model. But in all seriousness, let me answer this question because I think it's a very important question. I'm not trying to be contrarian. The role of the Gulf, as I theorize in my book, is the nerve center for this system around the Eurasian rimland, from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. And this is a structural job. This is because they're the energy source, they're the capital provider for every single big ticket item infrastructure that's taking place across that sort of Eurasian rimland integration. They are the main air carrier groups that taking people from London to the Indo-Pacific, and this is not going to go away. And on top of that, there are the cities where you have that sort of global elites mingle and live and work and find things that you can really find in their own home capitals. On top of all of that, they're very much integrated within the American security architecture. I mean, we can debate that level of integration and what does it mean. But those fundamentals do not go away. Those fundamentals do not change with the war. Absolutely not. Actually, I would say they reinforce the role as a nerve center. And someone would argue, well, maybe we should diversify. Okay, so who else is going to take the role of Dubai or Doha, Riyadh? I don't particularly believe that there's any other city or cities uh, are able to take that sort of job. I think you're going to see the Gulf reconstituting after the war. I agree that you're going to have people coming back who left, and I still think that the numbers were actually very minimal. I think the security profile of the Gulf might change, but the economic profile of the Gulf will not change because those things are indigenous, those things are local, those things are driven by local dynamics. Those things are driven by the Mubadlas and the PIFs and the Qatar Investment Authority. Those are $6 trillion under assets under management in the Gulf. Qatar Airways, Etihad, Fly Emirates are not going to go anywhere. This is a region that builds structures and systems. So yes, there is a new security profile right now. There is a war between Israel and the Iranians. Absolutely true. But those also are the countries that succeeded in intercepting 97, 96% of missiles and drones, and which is a very high successful rate. So my big bet is this war has an impact, will change the political risk profile for sure. There's no debate about that. But in terms of the role of the Gulf, the model of the Gulf, the new political economy of the Gulf, I think they're going to double down on all the things that they have been doing before the war: AI infrastructure, logistics, socioeconomic transformation, tourism destination. Those things are not going to go anywhere.
It's a very interesting point there because one of the things people forget about is just the strength of the Qatari sovereign wealth fund. I mean, Qatari quarters in London and owning and in the whole. Anyone who's a Premier League fan or football fan can see the impact of these airlines and these Middle East institutions all over there. And I want to welcome Isaac Stonefish. Isaac, thank you for joining us. I don't think we can see you or hear you just yet, so we want to change that in a second. But if you're on camera, I would want to start getting you involved in the conversation. But in the meantime, I want to continue the conversation with you, Dinsha. Like every time we speak about the Middle East, there's almost like the one or two words that are synonymous, right? It's almost like playing a game of taboo if you can't talk about the Middle East and not mention the word oil or energy. And officials today still quote about, the LPG issue still worrisome back in India. But I want to talk about another country that's benefiting from all this. To paraphrase a James Bond movie, it's to Russia with love. Russia is benefiting financially from this crisis, because Tehran's retaliatory strikes that Mohammed spoken about, have sort of paralyzed crude oil shipments. We're talking about the Strait of Hormuz that everyone now knows where it is, given so it's such a vital, choke point. Secretary Bessent has also announced this 30-day waiver on sanctions that were imposed on Russian energy sales. Of course, don't forget, for the last 1 year, this was a major irritant for the administration with New Delhi's purchase of Russian energy, which have always been historic. And India's always clarified it's a 1.4 billion population, one of the largest in the world now. So India is a net energy importer, and it's vital for India's energy security. So we discussed this on the last webinar. We took this circuitous route of no Russian oil. Okay, we'll reduce Russian oils. India reduced Russian oils. Tariffs were there. Tariffs came down. Are we just back in the same place? We took a scenic route, but we're just back in the same place.
No, I think I can't say strongly enough. I would not want to be Russia or Vladimir Putin right now. Previously had a very strong position in the Middle East, right now. One of his closest friends from that region, Bashar al-Assad, is hiding in some Moscow neighborhood. When you look at Russia's activities in, for instance, this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, Maduro is now locked up in a US jail. Cuba is teetering and on the brink. So if I'm Putin and I'm looking at the map, I've been fighting for this little strip of land on the eastern edge of Ukraine that wasn't that productive to begin with and now is completely a war zone. And just geopolitically, I'm on my heels pretty much everywhere else. I don't see India either turning that strongly to Russia. Sure, there might be certain things like, as you mentioned, a 30-day reprieve to buy Russian oil. The Russians aren't giving any discount this time, and that's for good reason. They know that this is just a partnership of convenience. But long term, Russia has really played its cards, I think, pretty improperly over the last 4 or 5 years, and I would say even longer. Uh, and Indian leaders are smart enough. I mean, they're plenty smart to recognize that the long-term bet isn't with Russia. It's going to be with the West. It's going to be with the US. It's going to be whatever power emerges, presumably in the Middle East, presumably the countries that are aligned with the Abraham Accords. So yes, in the short term, India might buy some oil. Yes, they still have the defense relationship that they have to think about, where they have to get their military service, their weapons and things like that. But by and large, India and Russia over the next, say, 5, 10, 15 years, that's a relationship of divergence. There's no convergence there. That's how I see it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Given that the relationship was historically energy and defense procurements, and I think
Mhm.
that's been constantly moving in the last 25 years as US-India defense sale was zero in 2000 and now well over 20 billion. And you've even seen even Prime Minister Modi and President Trump in 2025, had US-India trust and US-India compact. I said, of course, became trust. And so now the defense and technology relationship is sort of where I think the calculus has moved. Mohammed, I wanted to get to another interesting part. You mentioned through your book, and what I found very interesting, because India's foreign policy had a very Act East policy, but you touch on that in your little bit of book, West Asia. It's moving east. You speak about the trade volume between India and Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken, 50 billion, and the same between India and UAE at around 100 billion. And that's 150 billion, which cumulatively exceeds 120 billion between India and all EU member nations. So there's a strong merit that beyond remittance that people talk about, beyond the energy thing, that Gulf states are looking at India and in eastward. And with the current geopolitical stabilization, what do these trade figures mean both in the short run and the long run? What has your research proven?
So let me add a caveat here. $120 billion is a good trade between EU and India. I think when you add services, it's close to 165 billion dollars a year. It's still the numbers are giving the story. What I argue in the book is that the borders that separated the Mediterranean, Red Sea, Indian Ocean are no longer there. And I'm using trade and migration logistics as an evidence of this sort of convergence between South Asia and the Middle East. To your question about the UAE and Saudi Arabia, it's part of the rise of both. It's the rise of Saudi, it's the rise of UAE, it's the rise also of India when it comes to GDP, and basically that translates into GDP, into trade volume. So yeah, there's a story beyond the question of remittances and the question of Indian labor in the Gulf states. Absolutely. I think one of the challenges that we don't really have an architecture for that sort of system, right? We don't have a trade framework. We don't have a geopolitical arrangement or a security format for discussions. And one of the main themes of the book, I'm trying, listen, United States job should be order building, not really nation building. And we should borrow from the things that we have done in the Indo-Pacific, the way that Shinzo Abe rebranded or changed the orientation from Asia Pacific to the Indo-Pacific. Should be our own discourse in Middle East, framing it as West Asia, making sure that we have different formats that bring different partners to discuss different issues. Because I'm not fixated on one issue. I'm also not fixated on a certain partner. Because by the way, there's a case for India, but also there's a case for Bangladesh. There's a case for Pakistan. Those countries are not going to go anywhere. And also on another aspect of it is, I am making the case that the centrality of the Gulf states are the driving seat for this. I'm making the case that the capital flow, the rise of the Gulf, the role that the Gulf plays on the international level are the main reason for that sort of integration. And let me add another even caveat. After that war, if there's any sort of assumptions that the Gulf states are waiting for another great power to come to play the role that the Brits and the Americans played, I think people are misreading the Gulf and misreading the moment. The Gulf countries have invested heavily in their own defense platforms. They're very capable countries. I think actually they're going to double down and increase that sort of military capacity after this war. This is a different sort of inflection point for the Gulf from a security standpoint, but also as a collective Gulf identity standpoint. So I'm not making the case in my book for India to be some sort of a security guarantor. I don't think that this is a role India can play or want to play, actually, in the Gulf. You're going to have different partners based on different players. Let me give an example of this. The air defense systems that you're seeing in Abu Dhabi are Koreans. The Air Force, the European partner that exists there for security reasons are the French. The Koreans built the nuclear capacity of the UAE. The Japanese launched the UE space mission. You have a very diversified partnerships in the region, and this will be the new norm. And our job as the United States is how to cohere this into a system and make sure that we should not really build a NATO-esque alliance, because this is not going to work. You need different agile formats based on different issues, different interests, and different players, because it doesn't mean also we should stick with certain countries. Maybe right now I'm making the case that Saudi Arabia is an extremely important country in the Gulf, absolutely important. If there's no Saudi-Israel normalization, then we should not get fixated on certain old frameworks. We should move on and think differently, because this regional integration is important. This is the core interest for us as the United States.
So, Akshay, let me ask, just at the risk of derailing here a little bit, how do
No,
you see
far from
the
it. Please go on.
Saudi and Pakistan recently did this mutual defense pact, and it makes sense that India would continue to cooperate, especially in the light of the earlier comments you made about how alliance structures have shifted. The Gulf is clearly going to pursue even India's adversaries like Pakistan, perhaps with just as much enthusiasm as they pursue India. But what's your interpretation of a defense arrangement like that? Why was that done? What's the purpose of it? Why might India have to be concerned, or should India just not be concerned at all about something like this?
I don't think it's about India, to be honest. Like, I don't think that the Saudi-Pakistan deal is about India or Delhi at all. This is a response to a different new dynamic in the Gulf, and this was the Israel attacks on Doha, which I think was extremely impactful on so many of the Gulf capitals that they have to think about different security arrangements with different partners. And the Pakistanis have always been a strong partner to Saudi Arabia on the security front. That's not really any sort of anomaly or something new. That has always been the case for so many years. And also, it's the same year where the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman hosted Modi in Jeddah, meaning it also doesn't really mean that the economic partnership or the engagement with India will be forgotten. The same thing also with the UAE. The UAE has a strong relationship with India. In the same time, you have Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed in Pakistan and meeting with the Pakistani Prime Minister and the Pakistani General Director of the Army. So those things are going to be the new norm of engagement, because at the end of the day, it's all about how the Gulf is thinking about their own role globally, and also the way they're thinking about their own regional or trans-regional partnerships from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. So this is going to be a main driver for how they're engaging with different countries, different partners. But I don't believe it will end up being 100% alignment with one specific actor. I think this is not really because of them. This is an indictment of the whole era of where we are right now. Like, no one is going to make one big choice. This era has ended with the end of the Cold War.
That's an interesting question, Dinsha, and I want to caveat that we are at the half-hour mark. So if anyone has questions, please try and keep them coming to the chat box. And as I speak, Isaac, welcome to the webinar. It's great to see you on camera. Yeah. So apropos of questions, I'm gonna yeah, perfect. Thank you for joining us. Apropos of questions, I want to kind of give you one. I want to just tap into your vast repository of China expertise. Everyone was looking forward to this much awaited meeting between President Trump and President Xi. Was set to take place later this month. I think between March 31st, April 2, but President Trump and the White House officials have delayed the trip. No prize for guessing why. The POTUS has stated that delayed by 4 or 5 weeks as the Iran war takes center stage. Let's get the Beijing perspective on this, because you kind of live and breathe China, you lived in China, you kind of China staple diet for you. But what would be Beijing's top ask from President Trump? Given China's such a net importer and depend on Iranian crude, for LNG from Qatar, is this economic ramification for China very wide? Given that when China sneezes, most of the world catches a cold, is there a concern that Beijing is looking at this thing, it needs this war to end as most of us want it to, but what is the situation right now from Beijing's perspective?
Thank you. Beijing's top goals, as they always are all political. And so, what Beijing wants the most from Trump is removal of any guarantee or security assurance for Taiwan, to basically do whatever the U.S. can to yield Taiwan to China. Beijing wants the U.S. to stop challenging China globally. It ideally wants the U.S. to recede from its security commitments in Asia more broadly. It would love if the U.S. removed or reduced troops in South Korea and Japan. It wants it to stop funding entities that in any way criticize the Chinese Communist Party. And basically, in Xi Jinping's dream world, it would love for the U.S. to recede to allow China to be the world's most dominant country.
I want to stay with you on that for a minute more because the idea that this much awaited meeting was supposed to solve a few things, right? There's, of course, the focus on trade issues, given the trade kerfuffle between Beijing and Washington, even dominated Trump 1.0. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent actually said that the visit wouldn't be delayed because President Trump demanded China police Strait of Hormuz, to quote directly, which President Trump also clarified in an interview, I think, with FT, that his priority was reopening the strait. But this is really funny because Washington now needs its principal strategic competitor in Beijing to help manage the crisis. I mean, was this on anyone's 2026 bingo card?
Gosh, I mean, think about this several years ago with Venezuela and Panama and Greenland. I mean, if you looked at my bingo card, I think I'd be batting pretty low to mix a bunch of metaphors there. But I think in terms of what we're seeing with US, China, and Iran, we have to remember that China is not on the United States side. And it's very similar to the war with Russia, Ukraine, where China is on Russia's side in that war. And Beijing pretends globally to be for stability, peace, international free trade, while very actively supporting Russia in its war effort. And it's quite similar with Iran. China has been Iran's largest trading partner for at least the last dozen years. It's provided tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue and other types of money transfers to Iran. And the primary reason why the Iranian regime, primary international reason why the Iranian regime hasn't collapsed years ago is because of Chinese financial support. And so the international community has to be careful about expecting China to go against its interests, but also to go against, its last decade plus of policy vis-a-vis Iran.
There's a very interesting concept right now. I mean, in some ways, when you look at US-China relations, you can say there's the TTT factor right now, there's a Tehran issue, there's a trade factor, and of course, Taiwan. And we touched on a little bit of the Taiwan right now. There's a lot of analogies were written since 2022. China watchers pointed out, this delay, state visit by President Trump could also mean a delay in arms sales to the self-governing island. Comparisons were written of Taiwan to Ukraine the same way of not exactly a sitting duck, but facing a much larger aggressor in China, the same way Ukraine did with Russia. And China has explicitly stated in the past it wants to take the island by force. The US is obviously obligated by its own law to kind of give the island sufficient hardware to defend itself. But, anticipating a summit at some point, Isaac, how's the Trump administration right now viewing the Taiwan security angle? But what is just the East Asia calculus right now? And particularly as we speak about the technology part, semiconductors, given TSMC is the epicenter, it's a nerve center for global semiconductors. Taiwan produces, I believe, 60% of global chips, 90% of semiconductors. So we're not in a cold war between US and China, far from it, but the AI race has taken its life of its own, very redolent of the space race that defined a lot of the Cold War.
It's a great question. So we have to distinguish President Trump himself from the rest of the Trump administration. Most of the top members of the administration are quite hawkish on China. President Trump isn't. And most of them care deeply about an independent Taiwan and would love to maneuver the United States to actually recognizing Taiwan as a country. As you rightly pointed out, a real concrete difference between Taiwan and Ukraine is most countries in the world recognize Ukraine. as a independent nation, and only roughly a dozen countries recognize Taiwan, and we don't even recognize Taiwan. And so Beijing has successfully isolated Taiwan globally over the last several decades, and that has a lot of meaningful implications. On where the Trump administration is likely to go vis-a-vis Taiwan, it actually has a very important AI angle in that the arm of the White House that's traditionally been most pro-Beijing has been the AI boosters, has been folks like David Sachs. And as US rank and file, and I'd argue especially a lot of grassroots MAGA folk, sour on AI and feel frustrated by AI taking jobs, data centers costing money and sucking up energy, this idea of a shadowy class of tech billionaires expanding their influence across America. Trump is a very successful and very, say, thoughtful or emotive weather vane on these issues. And so I do think that's going to strongly impact US China policies and allow for those in the White House who want to have more hawkish policies, who want to be more supportive of Taiwan, to take more of the upper hand.
Mohammed, I want to kind of come to you about this, right? Because you write a lot about AI in the Middle East, and I kind of wanted to get your explanation of the method and the madness, right? Because there's combining your AI and technology and Middle East expertise. Many were flummoxed, the way Iran has sort of gone about attacking GCC states, which sort of express neutrality. The fact that Iran's targeting Dubai is not ideological. It's not a Shia Sunni thing. But would some people think Iranian drone strikes have damaged, obviously, very key nerve centers for US technology, data centers across the UAE and Bahrain that have caused outages and disruptions, hitting the airport, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, which we talked about. These are some very vital economic choke points. I mean, the and we touched on Dubai's goal right now, but what the outlook for Dubai is. But is Dubai's stated neutrality irrelevant to the calculation? Is this the fact that Iran's just trying to be an agent of chaos? And what is the outlook for AI right now, given the fact that some of these very key data centers have been damaged in the Middle East?
I mean, you throw me a very complicated question. Let me try to unpack a few things. So what's happening? Let's start with what's happening in the Middle East when it comes to AI. I would argue that the Gulf states are the third biggest AI theater outside of the United States and China, just by the volume of the amount of capital dedicated to building this AI infrastructure in UAE and Saudi Arabia. And just give people numbers, we have globally between 70 to 90 gigawatt compute, depends on how you count them, between United States and China. United States, we have about, let's say 70%, the Chinese have about 15 to 18% of the global compute, and the rest is for the rest of the countries. The Gulf states are building close to 9 to 12 gigawatt compute. This is basically my own estimate of how much they are building. And let me add some numbers here. For every gigawatt compute that we're building, we need anywhere between 30 to $50 billion. And this is not available for any country on earth just to basically go and build gigawatts of compute. It's very specific class of countries, and the Gulf countries are those are the powers are dedicating to build that. And why they're building it? Because this is the transformation of their political economy for post-oil. That's something that's core to their national interest. This is core to the visions of those Gulf leaders. B, because someone needs to build that sort of compute for us to keep in pace with personal intelligence, robo-taxis, physical AI. We need anywhere between 220 to 300 gigawatt in the next 5 years. Someone needs to go build that. And it's not going to happen in Europe. I'm telling you that because I work on AI infrastructure in Europe. Europeans are not building that. And this is not really taking place in Asia as well, right? Energy constraints, landmass, capital commitment. So the Gulf states are playing that sort of role, and they are well underway. So why the Iranians attack that, and why they attack data centers and airports and ports and tourist destinations? Because they're going after the pillars of this new political economy of the Gulf, that the Gulf states are way ahead, and this is clearly creating different incentive structures for the Iranians when it comes to how to think about the Gulf from a security standpoint. So when the war happens and they went after those assets, it confirmed the idea that this was already pre-planned, that those are the targets that the Iranians have always wanted to target. And when the Israelis attacked, that was the most automatic response that we have had. I think that those attacks confirm the vision of the Gulf states, that this should be their own political economy, that this should be their own future discourse. I think they're going to be doubling down, and they're backed by $6 trillion in those sovereign wealth funds. They don't really need any outside investor to go and build or bring back some of those things in the Gulf. The Gulf will be focused on the Gulf after the war, and they're going to remember who was standing there and who was cheering for the Iranians while they're doing this.
Dinsha, I'd be remiss if I didn't come to you. You're sitting in Stanford, Silicon Valley. Two things I remember. Prime Minister Modi's speech in 2015. He says Silicon Valley is one of the last places which sees daylight, but one of the first few places where inventions see light of day. And of course, in 2023, he quipped to President Biden, AI stands for America and India. So, given this lot of work that the US and India are doing on US India Trust and Compact, especially ISET, has kind of moved from the NSA level to trust, where it's, talking about semiconductors and data centers and very important critical elements. And you and I touched base on IndusX 2 years ago, where we kind of saw Silicon Valley follow this back to the future model, the military industrial complex of the 50s and 60s. So, what is in your research, the AI calculus right now in the current state of the world geopolitics, particularly in US-India relations, which is, a good time to discuss it after the AI Impact Summit.
Again, you're throwing a big question with lots to unpack there. I think
That's why I have a stellar panel.
there you go. By and large, so two governments have tried to do big initiatives between one another in really cutting edge areas. And that makes sense in certain ways for defense technology. But by and large, when we talk about AI build out and things like that, both India and the US are market economies. This is going to be, I would say, much more led by the private sector and the dominant players in the private sector. Let's keep in mind that this is still a bet, right? We don't know if building data centers, today for 10, 20, 30-year sort of lifespans when technology changes so fast, if that's going to pay out, right? And so given that it's a bet, the question is who should be making that bet? Both the US and the India as private market players, it's going to be largely on private sector players. So for instance, if Google wants to do something in India, if Alphabet wants to do something in India, they will figure it out. USG will play a supporting and complementary role, but it's not going to be something where, Modi and Trump sit in a room and say, this is how we're going to intertwine our AI and technology futures. In defense, a little bit different, but by and large, that's how I see it.
That's what I found very fascinating about IndusX. For people who may not be aware, that's India-US defense innovation thing, and literally someone in then DoD, now DOW, said X because it sounds cool. And what I found fascinating was it's not just defense decision restricted to the Pentagon or the Ministry of Defense in New Delhi. It's PEs, VCs, startups who now have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get go on, please, Dinsha.
No, that's something that's actually changed just in the last 5 years, 10 years of living here. There used to be a lot more hesitation for people who are working in tech to get into defense. And you still see some elements of that, for instance, with the recent protest by Anthropic for joining defense. But by and large, the rank and file, there seems to be more of an acceptance that the world is a dangerous place and that their tools are what they are, which is tools. And it seems like a lot more people who are producing this stuff, defense capabilities and AI-enabled defense capabilities, are a lot more comfortable now talking to defense establishments. We see in the Bay Area a lot of US investors, USG pushing for things. You see Israel, and of course, India is a little bit further behind, but it's picking up in that regard.
The world's most dangerous place. I mean, since Russia's war of Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza in 2023, and now it's well established. Isaac, I wanted to get to you about this. I lived in Singapore for many years, and a lot of the China scholars there would keep talking about understanding China. You have to understand history, not just to understand the CCP. You have to go back to the Ming Dynasty or the Qing Dynasty, and it's very interesting because obviously the great phrase of those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. Fareed Zakaria recently did an analysis which is very interesting about how Britain was the sole dominant power in the 19th century, courtesy of the Industrial Revolution, and it faded away in part of the 20th century as the empire was too distracted with these peripheral conflicts in its colonies across Middle East and Africa and of course South Asia. But he said America kind of focused on industrialization back home, building we talk about the military industrial complex, but the most robust economy. And that dominated the later half of the 20th century and depends to be seen where the 21st century goes. He says right now there's a similar story happening. The US again being caught in this conflict and quagmires, not learning from Vietnam, but right now you're in the Middle East. All this while China is not getting enmeshed in a Middle East quagmire, but working on AI, quantum, chips, solar, and more. Is this valuable lessons that you can learn from empire's decline? I mean, grand strategy, after all, is about prioritizing very finite resources, right?
Right, right. So when people say you have to pay more attention to Chinese history, they often mistakenly look at China's more ancient history, or they look at the so-called century of humiliation, and they refuse to contend with China's more recent history. And they think, oh, Chinese people are obsessed with the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion, and they forget the tens of millions of family members that died under Mao from 1949 to 1976. And that's the recent history that we should really look at to understand China today, as opposed to looking back centuries and millennia. On history as a palimpsest or a reflection for today, the existential question for all of us is the world war that we're very likely walking into, is this more similar to World War One, or is this more similar to World War Two? And we do not know where China plays in that. China is almost certainly the adversary of the United States, and you can't have World War Three without the US and China on opposing sides. It won't be World War Three until both parties join. And I don't know if the right analogy for China is Nazi Germany or Germany during World War One, or perhaps even the UK during World War One. These are questions that we really need to debate and talk about very explicitly. I also think, we tend to focus on, say, China's investments in quantum or AI, which I think actually is much more a reflection of the brilliance of Chinese people and the way that they can move around the party, as opposed to something directed by the Communist Party itself, and not enough at the political reality of China, which really dominates the conversation. And so it's less that Xi Jinping is really focusing on the economy, and more that he is prioritizing, as he always has, political control. And, the purges in the PLA should be seen in that light. The various increasing restrictions on Chinese and business environment should be seen in that light. And we have to be very, very careful to parse the difference between what Chinese leaders and Chinese entities say and what they actually mean. And this is true in countries around the world. People don't take President Trump at face value. They don't take European politicians at face value. And we can't read, China's 5-year plan or Chinese remarks and take them at face value, not only because we can't take political speech anywhere at face value, but also, like, Beijing is very clear, when you read documents, that this is propaganda. It's the word that they use in Chinese. This is information that's intended to shape reality as opposed to reflect reality.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You can't take the speech at face value, because I remember during the last few years of this Middle East configuration, there was a great speech which someone said that don't listen to Middle East leaders, what they say publicly in English, read what they say privately in Hebrew or Arabic. And I think Mohammed will obviously have be able to add into that a little more. But before I do that, Dinsha, we spoke about infrastructure. So I want to China is obviously very central to infrastructure in the Middle East, and but I want to get your thoughts on something a little more specific. For India, apart from the energy economy, which was, I think India was importing oil from Iran till 2019, what does it leave infrastructure initiatives such as the Chabahar port? Because a lot has been written about it, but try to understand a little more after this particular conflict. Of course, Chabahar and Gwadar in Pakistan are sort of emerging deep sea ports of the Makran coast, competitor ports, India and Iran on one side for Chabahar, China and Pakistan for Gwadar through CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which of course many people see as a debt trap diplomacy. But how are we thinking about these long-term implications of these two seaports? And while I ask you on the infrastructure route, Dinsha, what does it mean for the India-Middle East Economic Corridor? Because it was announced in September 2023 and October 2023 happened, and then nothing really. So are we talking about another soft death or just a long, long, long hiatus for IMEC?
Yeah, I think so. Chabahar Port is this port that India supported in Iran that helped build it. India helped build it out. Right now, India, because of sanctions and other geopolitical concerns, has backed off from that port. Generally, I see India playing a much larger role, both in infrastructure, port infrastructure, and this isn't just in Iran, but across the Middle East as well. But also in blue economy. all sorts of opportunities from fishing to seabed mining, things like that. Some of this stuff is 10, 20 years away, but for at least India's capabilities. But definitely something as India completes its own infrastructure domestically, that's an area where I would expect Indian expansion to take place in a big way. So we'll see. I think that part of the motivation will be to counter China, but by and large, it's also just a great economic opportunity for India. On IMEC, I think the details there still have to be worked out. Again, this was something that was, I would say, more initiated by governments rather than private sectors. And so the economics of IMEC, this corridor that people talk about reaching from India all the way through the Middle East up into Europe, uh, I haven't really seen the economic argument made for why it would make sense to do such massive infrastructure investment to facilitate goods or any other kinds of things moving that way. But broadly, it seems like the signal is that the countries want to work together, and where the private sector can figure out opportunities, whether that's, for instance, through data sharing, through communication running through that area, if in any way, shape, or form energy can run. Of course, that would originate from the Middle East and spread out in the other two directions. Any of those ways, I think the governments are sending a clear signal that they want to work together, that they want to facilitate and encourage economy. And I think that that's the right way of seeing IMEC, not as something where you're going to see some massive, freeway that somehow develops linking Mumbai to Eastern Europe, but in other ways, smaller ways, perhaps, that could deepen over time.
Yeah, there's a very interesting part about IMEC, and I want to obviously get to Mohammed and Isaac to kind of explain China's grand strategy in the Middle East. It's a very particular concept because for a lot of people, IMEC would be at least, we see your Belt and Road Initiative and we raise you IMEC, given this economic corridors of trust that you want to try and build around roads, rails, infrastructure, of course, data centers, and Mohammed has written a lot about as the kingdom moves from a traditional energy economy to this technology, trying to be this technology powerhouse in the region. And it was also perhaps old Silk Route, new Spice Route in some form. But that's a good segue to asking you both, Mohammed and Isaac, on China's grand strategy in the Middle East. From Beijing's perspective, it would be like telling the Middle East, like, look, we don't have any of the colonial hangovers of Britain and France of carving you up, and we're not the United States that's been in the Middle East and been part of very unholy wars. And Beijing doesn't care about your political philosophy, but if you want roads, rail, infrastructure, why not invest in it? And there was this very redolent when you go to LATAM and Africa. When I saw in El Salvador, the National Library signed in Espanol and Mandarin, and El Salvadorans have been like, what do we care about? If China's investing here, why won't we take the money? So what is China's grand strategy in the Middle East? And perhaps say from Iran's perspective, which had a lot of sanctions on it, that relationship is very important.
That's an excellent, very tough question as always. I'm going to give you a very controversial statement, and I put this in a piece 2 years ago. I don't believe that there was a grand alliance that included the Iranians and the North Koreans and the Chinese, and I think that this was more of a projection rather than actual reality. And where is China from what's happening in Iran right now? We had the 12-day war last year. Supposedly, you can rebuild air defense systems in months, at least a year. You would have some tangible Chinese assets on the ground. You would have more tangible Russian assets on the ground in Iran. And I don't believe that there's evidence, like beyond Russia, of course, offering coordinates and other support to the Iranians, but like the actual material support you would expect from an alliance partner or alliance member. I don't think that we have seen that in this war. I don't believe that, never believed this 2 years ago. I don't believe this today. To your question about China, and this is something I say in my book. Whether successful or partially successful the Belt and Road Initiative is, and what actually constitutes the Belt and Road Initiative, because I know that a lot of things are getting branded as such, it's still a vision for what Asia under Chinese economic dominance would look like. Simple, right? This is a Chinese vision about how we think about Asia as a system economically, and where we envision China, which is the global factory floor, fits into all of that. And based on that, we're going to be arranging our own economic engagements across those sorts of lines. America did not have a vision for economic integration in Asia. Part of it is we do not have a public support for trade deals anymore. We don't. Republicans or Democrats, that's not really in our own political discourse right now. We are a Western Hemisphere nation, and we are some part, we are not really an industrial power as we used to. So some of those big questions in Eurasia are not really American questions. And IMEC, to your question, was an idea about how to bring people to work together. Because I agree with my colleague here. This was more of like, let's get together to discuss how can we add a framework on our own existing engagement across trade, around capital flow, around people travel. Whether successful or not, that's also not the point, because also, as I say in my book, you might have different corridors, you might have different frameworks, you might have different formats to discuss digital resiliency or AI infrastructure or cross-border data. You don't really need to have the IMEC brand as the brand of engagement. You're going to have multiple viewpoints and multiple initiatives living side by side. I think the question will always be, what's the day after the Iran war? I think this is the one thing that we should pay attention to. What's the day after the Iran war when it comes to Asian markets? When it comes to the political economy, what does it mean for global energy markets? What does it mean for the Gulf? What does it mean for Iran? I made the case that there was no China-Iran alliance. If that regime survives, and if the new leader in Tehran survives, will the calculus change? I don't know. Those are all open questions. I'm not going to be one of those guys who are going to pretend that I have like a crystal clear ball about what's going to happen in 3-4 months from now. But I think the situation is very dynamic, and the energy infrastructure attacks that we have seen yesterday are indicative that we're not really heading towards an off-ramp soon.
Yeah.
So those are all the big questions that we have to face. And believe me, it doesn't look like a good story so far.
No one's sanguine. Isaac, we're almost at the witching hour. Bring us home. China's grand strategy in the Middle
Okay.
East.
So I'll say a nice non-controversial, placid thing to end. Beijing's primary interest in the Middle East is to distract from its atrocities in Xinjiang and to shine attention on Israel-Palestine. And Beijing's economic, political, military, strategic involvement in the Middle East, the primary goal of that is to allow Beijing to be seen as a friend to Middle East countries and to Muslim people, while at the same time destroying Qurans, forcing Muslims in China to eat pork, putting them in re-education camps, and treating them in a way that if another global power did, there would be a massive, massive global outcry that Beijing has successfully been able to avoid. And I would say right up there with oil, and perhaps even more important than oil to China, is if there is a regime change in Iran, and Iran either now or at some point evolves into a more representative democracy. Who knows if that's going to happen? I'm certainly not saying that's the most likely outcome. But if it does, Iran could be the Middle East power that actually speaks out against Xinjiang, which no Muslim country has really done since Erdogan did in 2007, I think it was, when he called it a genocide. In 2018, 2019, after China's actions more reflected global definitions of genocide, I think there was a Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson from Turkey, which expressed regret. Middle Eastern countries, the leadership, I should say, rather, of Middle Eastern countries has almost without exception given Beijing a very, very large pass for what it's done in Xinjiang. And Beijing's ability to tie its economic development to its political needs has made that a very, very effective and, for Beijing, sadly, a winning strategy.
Well, we had a lot of questions today. Dinsha, Isaac, and Mohammed, you've done your best to hit it all out of the park. And more questions are going to come up as Mohammed already said, there is no off-ramp anytime soon. So it'll take a little longer than a few weeks as the president announced. But this has been the 10th episode of Indo-Pacific Security Dialogues, a little beyond the Indo-Pacific because the world's a much bigger place. But thank you so much to Isaac, Dinsha, and Mohammed. This has been live streamed on our YouTube channel. It will be available later. So please go revisit the pearls of wisdom that Dinsha, Mohammed, and Isaac have done. And Mohammed, congratulations on your book. Look out for Dinshaw's book as well. And thank you all to all three of you. And we'll hope to have you soon. And for the rest of everyone else, have a pleasant weekend. Thank you so much.